I'm Neeta Misra, the executive editor for public policy at Business World magazine, the oldest business magazine in India. And this is Policy Matters. In this edition of Policy Matters, we speak with Dr. Purnima Menon, a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. What is the picture emerging for malnutrition and the pandemic?
A couple things. Firstly, we know that a lot of what we see as visible malnutrition, especially what we measure as, child malnutrition, et cetera, is affected by what happens in terms of food systems. It's affected by what happens in health systems. And it's really affected by what happens in society, especially around the lives of girls and women. And what we saw during the pandemic was that, every system took a hit, right? And there was a shock to every single system in the sense that the economic systems that underpin whether families have enough, money to buy and purchase foods that they want to eat, that took substantial hits. Health systems took huge hits. We know there were major disruptions to the provision of routine healthcare. Certainly because the educational systems took hits, we know that there were, girls who were falling out of school. There was likely early marriages happening, early pregnancies, all of which sort of affect, how children grow and thrive, which is what we measure in different surveys and other things. But I think what we also saw through the pandemic was, really at the end of the day, fairly substantial efforts that many governments around the world, including, the government of India, governments across South Asia, state governments in India, subnational entities, there just was the sense that more has to be done. And so there were, deployments of new social protection instruments. There were efforts made to bring back routine health systems. And so, when you sort of look at the full spectrum of that, I think there are many bright spots in the context of what happened in a very dark time, really, in human history, right? The pandemic is something we're all going to be looking back at and learning from and trying to interpret for years to come. But the questions of whether those were enough, whether the hit that societies took has made a big difference. I actually don't think we're going to know about that for some years to come. It's a little bit like, what happened in World War II and the Dutch famine, for example. There was a period of time when the blockades led to very intense food insecurity, which in turn contributed to a very long-term impacts on human health. People have studied the effects of those short 9 months of food blockades on genetic imprinting of non-communicable diseases, on malnutrition outcomes, on long-term health outcomes for years and years and years to come. And that's one thing that we don't know yet with the pandemic. We know that perhaps governments were able to, deploy some food security programs a few months in that, people were able to be helped in some ways, but the full extent of the impact and it's impacts of all kinds, because there's traumas, there's missed vaccinations, there was probably missed antenatal care visits, pregnancy care visits, food insecurity and nutritional shortages at very critical periods of the life course. We will know the impacts of these for some many years to come, I think. So I really hope, given what we know about, what happened in the past, that researchers around the world will pay attention to this, that we will not forget to continue to examine the impacts of the pandemic on society.
Thank you, Dr. Menon, for that very interesting introduction to malnutrition during the pandemic. And to our viewers and listeners, this is the first in a series of interviews with Dr. Menon on malnutrition. Please stay tuned for more.